Hello everyone, and welcome back to another whiteboard video. Today we're going to talk about why you really only feel your back during hip thrusts and what you can do to fix it. So first things first, we just need to identify why does this happen, right? Because I think people generally interpret the hip thrust just very simply in simple terms as just a glute exercise, when in reality it's a little bit more complicated than that. So why is it a little bit more complicated? Well, if we think about the forces of this exercise and what are the forces doing to the body, a lot of people just assume that the force is the sort of barbell that you have on your hips and the weight of it going down. And that's true, but really only in part, because the only reason you're able to actually load that way and load your hips that way is because the floor is pushing the foot upward, sort of slightly backward, and the bench is kind of pushing the spine that way. So we'll take one side of this, at least now, and just ask yourself, like, okay, if there's something behind my body, like imagine someone comes up behind you and they put their hands on your back, right, and your shoulder blades, and they push you forward. What do you do to prevent that from happening? Well, you push back like this with your spine. You spinal extend. And obviously, to some extent, use your hips. And so that's what's occurring here. Just think about it very simply. What happens if something comes behind us and pushes our backs forward? Well, we have to use the stuff on the back side of the spine to prevent that from happening. So built into the exercise as a feature, not a bug, is spinal extension back recruitment, okay? But we know that we can do this exercise. Many people do this exercise and they don't feel a ton of their backs and they really just feel their glutes. So why is it that we have the situation where we're feeling so much of our backs rather than our glutes? Well, I think it comes down to one major mistake that people are making, which is as they lower down, they are not lowering down with both, let's say this is the top, so here's my spine, here's my femur. They're not lowering down with both of these segments sort of as these rigid levers that are just pivoting like this, kind of like a car crank or a car jack. What they're doing is they're allowing the spine, I'm going to over-exaggerate this, they're allowing their spine to kind of dip like that, right? So their pelvis, you can picture like their pelvis, I'll just draw it as a triangle that way. Their pelvis is basically falling toward the floor rather than gently lowering along with the femur here. Obviously the femur can't disconnect, right? I'm just trying to make a point of it. And so a helpful illustration for this might be, this is like a tripod thing, for you put your phone in and this can bend, okay? So picture this whole thing as the spine. A hip thrust wherein you really mainly feel your glutes, imagining that this is like the leg over here, might look like this, as I was just describing. Like these two rigid things, they're going boop, 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 boop. But the spine, in this case, and in the case where a lot of people feel their backs, what happens is a lot of the segments up here stay rigid, closer to where the actual bench is. But the lower segments, assuming this is like where your pelvis is, they kind of bend like that on the way down. Again, over-exaggerated, but they bend like this, and then when people reverse out of this, what do they have to do? They have to sort of unbend like this. So the whole motion just turns into this perpetual bending of the lower spine, unbending, bending, unbending, bending, unbending. And instead, what we should try to do is fix this. Imagine that this is a rigid rod, and you're just trying to make the rigid rod go like this. Now, a really helpful idea, I think, to implement with this strategy is rather than just thinking about, okay, I'm going to not do this thing. I'm not going to allow my pelvis to tip forward like I'm, doing some kind of twerk. If you don't know what a twerk is, where have you been the last decade? But yeah, people really end up just twerking their barbell hip thrusts, and that's why I think it feels like that. So a really helpful strategy to get back to it instead is to focus on these two contact points. It seems a little counterintuitive, but stay with me here. If this is the force of the bench and this is the force of the floor, and again, this barbell is pushing our hips downward, that's what we're using to just add magnitude to the situation. What I think is a great strategy is, again, rather than to think about holding this really rigid and how hard can I brace, just think about pushing constantly backward against that direction into the bench and thinking about driving your foot as far downward and directly downward, not forward, directly downward as you can. And what happens when you do this? What happens when you create this situation? Well, instead of this weird lumping down thing and then lumping back up thing happening, like I was just demonstrating with the tripod thing, what ends up happening is this whole spinal segment ends up staying really rigid because you're not trying to move through this segmentation strategy. You're just trying to push as hard backward into that as you can, much in the same way that you would like an RDL, where you're just basically trying to raise your back up into something that way. And in an RDL, you know that, maybe you know, that when you're doing an RDL and you're not allowing your spine to round, you tend to feel more stuff in your hips. And if you pair that with driving directly downward through the floor, these two bones, again, are basically just going to pivot up like this and pivot up like this, or this segment and this segment, because this is one bone, this is many bones. And what you end up with is, again, that top position that looks, if we just say that's the hip, like that, right? And the head obviously tilts backward. So another key thing here is to actually allow your head to tilt backward and then forward, because if it doesn't, a lot of the times at least, we end up with this bending strategy. So major takeaways: use your back, actually use your back, because using your back is what the exercise requires. And if you would try to avoid doing it by doing this tucking thing, you're just going to add to the amount of back that you use. And then in addition, make sure that you're using your feet. So I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you all in the next video. Are you someone that wants to be able to target any muscle in your body when you're lifting, but you also don't give a shit about complicated anatomy and biomechanics? If you are, then this is a perfect ebook for you. The Target Any Muscle ebook is not really an ebook. It's more like a lifetime cheat sheet guide to lifting. You need a total of 0 understanding of anatomy and biomechanics to understand this material. And that's because every chapter is full of tons of different diagrams and very visual, simple explanations about how to set up an exercise for any muscle. In addition, every chapter functions as a standalone guide, so you can simply click on the table of contents and navigate to any muscle group that you're training on any given day. Every single chapter includes visuals of how to stretch any muscle, how to shorten any muscle, how to load any muscle, and then how to stabilize your body so that you can train that muscle appropriately. And in addition, at the end of every chapter, there's a training FAQ to address commonly asked questions and a full video lecture summarizing each chapter with me and my skeleton model to demonstrate. This is meant to function as a cheat sheet for life. This should be the last product that you ever purchase about how to lift. I hope you all enjoy the guide. Happy gains.